In the shadow of the silent majorities, or The End of the Social, and other essays. The whole chaotic constellation of the social revolves around that spongy referent, that opaque but equally translucent reality, that nothingness, the masses. A statistical crystal ball, the masses are swirling with currents and flows, in the image of matter and the natural elements. So at least they are represented to us. They can be mesmerized, the social envelopes them, like static electricity, but most of the time, precisely, they form an earth asterisk, that is, they absorb all the asterisk. Translators note, throughout the text la masse, fa masse imply a condensation of terms which allows Baudrillard to make a number of central puns and allusions. For not only does la masse directly refer to the physical and philosophical sense of substance or matter, it can just as easily mean the majority or even the electrical usage of an earth, hence faire masse can simultaneously mean to form a mass, to form an earth or to form a majority. 1. Electricity of the social and political and neutralize it forever. They are neither good conductors of the political, nor good conductors of the social, nor good conductors of meaning in general. Everything flows through them, everything magnetizes them, but diffuses throughout them without leaving a trace. And, ultimately, the appeal to the masses has always gone unanswered. They do not radiate, on the contrary, they absorb all radiation from the outlying constellations of state, history, culture, meaning. They are inertia, the strength of inertia, the strength of the neutral. In this sense, the mass is characteristic of our modernity, as a highly implosive phenomenon, irreducible for any traditional theory and practice, even perhaps for any theory and practice at all. According to their imaginary representation, the masses drift somewhere between passive ity and wild spontaneity, but always as a potential energy, a reservoir of the social and of social energy, today a mute referent, tomorrow, when they speak up and cease to be the silent majority, a protagonist of history. Now, in fact, the masses have no history to write, neither 2. Past nor future, they have no virtual energies to release, nor any desire to fulfill, their strength is actual, in the present, and sufficient unto itself. It consists in their silence, in their capacity to absorb and neutralize, already superior to any power acting upon them. It is a specific inertial strength, whose effectivity differs from that of all those schemas of production, radiation, and expansion according to which our imaginary functions, even in its wish to destroy those same schemas. An unacceptable and unintelligible figure of implosion, stumbling block to all our systems of meaning, against which they summon all their resistance, and screening, with a renewed outbreak of signification, with a blaze of signifiers, the central collapse of meaning. The social void is scattered with interstitial objects and crystalline clusters which spin around and coalesce in a cerebral chiaroscuro. So is the mass, an in vacuo aggregation of individual particles, refuse of the social and of media impulses, an opaque nebula whose 3. Growing density absorbs all the surrounding energy and light rays, to collapse finally under its own weight. A black hole which engulfs the social. This is, therefore, exactly the reverse of a sociological understanding. Sociology can only depict the expansion of the social and its vicissitudes. It survives only on the positive and definitive hypothesis of the social. The reabsorption, the implosion of the social escapes it. The hypothesis of the death of the social is also that of its own death. The term mass is not a concept. T is a leitmotif of political demagogy, a soft, sticky, lumpen analytical notion. A good sociology would attempt to surpass it with more subtle categories, socio-professional ones, categories of class, cultural status, etc. Wrong, it is by prowling around these soft and acritical notions that one can go further than intelligent critical sociology. Besides, it will be noticed retrospectively that the concepts class, social relations, power, status, institution, and social itself, all those two explicit concepts which are the glory of the legitimate sciences, have also 4. Only ever been muddled notions themselves, but notions upon which agreement has nevertheless been reached for mysterious ends, those of preserving a certain code of analysis. To want to specify the term mass is a mistake, it is to provide meaning for that which has none. One says, the mass of workers. But the mass is never that of the workers, nor of any other social subject or object. The peasant masses of old were not in fact masses, only those form a mass who are freed from their symbolic bondage, released and destined to be no more than the innumerable endpoints of precisely those same theoretical models which do not succeed in integrating them and which finally only produce them as statistical refuse. The mass is without attribute, predicate, quality, reference. This is its definition, or its radical lack of definition. It has no sociological reality. It has nothing to do with any real population, body, or specific social aggregate. Any attempt to qualify it only seeks to transfer it back to sociology and rescue it from 5. This indistinctness, which is not even that of equivalence, but that of the neutral, that is to say neither one nor the other. There is no longer any polarity between the one and the other in the mass. This is what causes that vacuum and inwardly collapsing effect in all those systems which survive on the separation and distinction of poles. This is what makes the circulation of meaning within the mass impossible. It is instantaneously dispersed, like atoms in a void. This is also what makes it impossible for the mass to be alienated, since neither the one nor the other exist there any longer. A speechless mass for every hollow spokesman without a past. Admirable conjunction, between those who have nothing to say, and the masses, who do not speak. Ominous emptiness. S of all discourse. No hysteria or potential fascism, but simulation by precipitation of every lost referential. Black box of every referential, of every uncaptured meaning, of impossible history, of untraceable systems of representation. The mass is what remains when the social has been completely removed. Regarding the impossibility of making meaning circulate among the masses, the best example is God. The masses have hardly retained anything but the image of Him, never the idea. They have never been affected by the idea of God, which has remained a matter for the clergy, nor by anguish over sin and personal salvation. What they have retained is the enchantment of saints and martyrs, the last judgment, the dance of death, sorcery, the ceremony and spectacle of the church, the immanence of ritual, the contrast to the transcendence of the idea. They were and have remained pagans, in their way, never haunted by the supreme authority, but surviving on the small change of images, superstition, and the devil. Degraded practices with regard to the spiritual wager of faith? Indeed. It is their particular way, through the banality of rituals and profane simulacra, of refusing the categorical imperative of morality and faith, the sublime imperative of meaning, which they have always 7. Rejected. It isn't that they have not been able to attain the higher enlightenment of religion, they have ignored it. They don't refuse to die for a faith, for a cause, for an idol. What they refuse is transcendence, the uncertainty, the difference, the waiting, the asceticism which constitute the sublime exaction of religion. For the masses, the kingdom of God has always been already here on earth, in the pagan immanence of images, in the spectacle of it presented by the Church. Fantastic distortion of the religious principle. The masses have absorbed religion by their source rouse and spectacular manner of practicing it. All the great schemas of reason have suffered the same fate. They have only traced their trajectory, they have only followed the thread of their history along the thin edge of the social stratum bearing meaning, and on the whole they have only penetrated into the masses at the cost of their misappropriation, of their radical distortion. So it was with historical reason, political reason, cultural reason, revolutionary reason, so even with the very reason of the social, the most interesting since this seems inherent to the masses, and appears to 8. Have produced them throughout its evolution. Are the masses the mirror of the social? No, they don't reflect the social, nor are they reflected in the social, it is the mirror of the social which shatters to pieces on them. Even this image is not right, since it still evokes the idea of a hard substance, of an opaque resistance. Rather, the masses function as a gigantic black hole which inexorably inflects, bends and distorts all energy and light radiation approaching it, an implosive sphere, in which the curvature of spaces accelerates, in which all dimensions curve back on themselves and involve to the point of annihilation, leaving in their stead only a sphere of potential engulfment. The abyss of meaning. So it is with information. Whatever its political, pedagogical, cultural content, the plan is always to get some meaning across, to keep the masses within reason, an imperative to produce meaning that takes the form of the constantly repeated imperative to moraliza. 9. Information, to better inform, to better socialize, to raise the cultural level of the masses, etc. Nonsense, the masses scandalously resist this imperative of rational communication. They are given meaning, they want spectacle. No effort has been able to convert them to the seriousness of the content, nor even to the seriousness of the code. Messages are given to them, they only want some sign, they idolize the play of signs and stereotypes, they idolize any content so long as it resolves itself into a spectacular sequence. What they reject is the dialectic of meaning. Nor is anything served by alleging that they are mystified. This is always a hypocritical hypothesis which protects the intellectual complaisance of the producers of meaning. The masses spontaneously aspire to the natural light of reason. This in order to evade the reverse hypothesis, namely that it is in complete freedom. That the masses oppose their refusal of meaning and their will to spectacle to the ultimatum of meaning. They distrust, as with death, this transparency and this political will. They scent the simplifying terror which is behind the ideal hegemony of meaning, and they react in their own way, by reducing all articulate discourse to a single era. 10. Rational and baseless dimension, where signs lose their meaning and peter out in fascination, the spectacular. Once again, it is not a question of mystification, it is a question of their own exigencies, of an explicit and positive counter-strategy, the task of absorbing and annihilating culture, knowledge, power, the social. An immemorial task, but one which assumes its full scope today. A deep antagonism which forces the inversion of received scenarios. It is no longer meaning which would be the ideal line of force in our societies, that which eludes it being only waste intended for reabsorption some time or other. On the contrary, it is meaning which is only an ambiguous and inconsequential accident, an effect due to ideal convergence of a perspective space at any given moment, and which, moreover, has only ever really concerned a tiny fraction and superficial layer of our societies. And this is true of individuals also. We are only episodic conductors of meaning, for in the main, and profoundly, we form a mass, living most of the time in panic or haphazardly, above and beyond any meaning. Now, with this inverse hypothesis, every 11 thing changes. Take one example from 1,000 concerning this contempt for meaning, the folklore of silent passivities. On the night of Klaus Croissant's extradition, the TV transmitted a football match in which France played to qualify for the World Cup. Some hundreds of people demonstrated outside La Santé, a few barristers ran to and fro in the night, 20 million people spent their evening glued to the screen. An explosion of popular joy when France won. Consternation and indignation of the Illuminati over this scandalous indifference. Le Monde, 9 p.m. At that time the German barrister had already been taken out of La Santé. A few minutes later, Rocheteau scored the first goal. Melodrama of indignation. Not a single query about the mystery of this indifference. One same reason is always invoked, the manipulation of the masses by power, their mystification by football. In any case, this indifference ought not to be, hence it has nothing to 12. Tell us. In other words, the silent majority is even stripped of its indifference, it has no right even that this be recognized and imputed to it, Even this apathy must have been imposed on it by power. What contempt behind this interpretation! Mystified, the masses are not allowed their own behavior. Occasionally, they are conceded a revolutionary spontaneity by which they glimpse the rationality of their own desire, that yes, but God protect us from their silence and their inertia. It is exactly this indifference, however, that demands to be analyzed in its positive brutality, instead of being dismissed as white magic, or as a magic alienation which always turns the multitudes away from their revolutionary vocation. Moreover, how does it succeed in turning them away? Can one ask questions about the strange fact that, after several revolutions and a century or two of political apprenticeship, in spite of the newspapers, the trade unions, the parties, the intellectuals, and all the energy put into educating and mobilizing the people, there are still 1,000 persons who stand up and 20 million who remain passive, and not 13. Only passive, but who, in all good faith and with glee and without even asking themselves why, frankly prefer a football match to a human and political drama? It is curious that this proven fact has never succeeded in making political analysis shift ground, but on the contrary reinforces it in its vision of an omnipotent, manipulatory power, and a mass prostrate in an unintelligible coma. Now none of this is true, and both the above are a deception. Power manipulates nothing, the masses are neither misled nor mystified. Power is only too happy to make football bear a facile responsibility, even to take upon itself the diabolical responsibility for stupefying the masses. This comforts it in its illusion of being power, and leads away from the much more dangerous fact that this indifference of the masses is their true, their only practice, that there is no other ideal of them to imagine, nothing in this to deplore, but everything to analyze as the brute fact of a collective retaliation and of a refusal to participate in the recommended ideals, however enlightened. 14. What is at stake in the masses lies elsewhere. We might as well take note and recognize that any hope of revolution, the whole promise of the social and of social change has only been able to function up till now thanks to this dodging of the issue, this fantastic denial. We might as well begin again, as Freud did in the psychic order too, from this remainder, from this blind sediment, from this waste or refuse of meaning, from this unanalyzed and perhaps unanalyzable fact. Rise and fall of the political. The political and the social seem inseparable to us, twin constellations, since at least the French Revolution, under the sign of the economic. But for us today, this undoubtedly is only true of their simultaneous decline. 15. When the political emerged during the Renaissance from the religious and ecclesiastic spheres, to win renown with Machiavelli, it was at first only a pure game of signs, a pure strategy which was not burdened with any social or historical truth, but, on the contrary, played on the absence of truth. To begin with, the political space belonged to the same order as that of Renaissance mechanical theatre, or of perspective space in painting, which were invented at the same time. Its form was that of a game, not of a system of representation, semiurgy and strategy, not ideology. Its function was one of virtuosity, not of truth. The cynicism and immorality of Machiavellian politics lay there, not as the vulgar understanding has it in the unscrupulous usage of means, but in the offhand disregard for ends. Now, as Nietzsche well knew, it is in this disregard for a social, psychological, historical truth, in this exercise of simulacra as such, that the maximum of political energy is found, where the political is a game and is not yet given a reason. 16. It is since the 18th century, and particularly since the Revolution, that the political has taken a decisive turn. It took upon itself a social reference, the social invested it. At the same time, it entered into representation, its performance became dominated by representative mechanisms. The political scene became that of the evocation of a fundamental signified, the people, the will of the people, etc. It no longer worked on signs alone, but on meaning, henceforth summoned to best signify the real it expressed, summoned to become transparent, to moralize itself and to respond to the social ideal of good representation. For a long time, nevertheless, a balance came into play between the proper sphere of the political and the forces reflected in it, the social, the historical, the economic. Undoubtedly this balance corresponds to the golden age of bourgeois represent. 17. Representative systems. It is with Marxist thought, in its successive developments, that the end of the political and of its particular energy was inaugurated. Here began the absolute hegemony of the social and the economic, and the compulsion, on the part of the political, to become the legislative, institutional, executive mirror of the social. The autonomy of the political was inversely proportional to the growing hegemony of the social. Liberal thought always thrives on a kind of nostalgic dialectic between the two, but socialist thought, revolutionary thought openly postulates a dissolution of the political at some point in history, in the final transparency of the social. The social one. But, at this point of generalization, of saturation, where it is no more than the 0 degree of the political, at this point of absolute reference, of omnipresence and diffraction in all the interstices of physical and mental space, what becomes of the social itself? It is the sign of its end, the energy of the social is reversed, its 18. Specificity is lost, its historical quality and its ideality vanish in favor of a configuration where not only the political becomes volatilized, but where the social itself no longer has any name. Anonymous. The mass. The masses. The silent majority. The dwindling of the political from a pure strategic arrangement to a system of representation, then to the present scenario of neo-figuration, where the system continues under the same manifold signs but where these no longer represent anything and no longer have their equivalent in a reality or a real social substance. There is no longer any political investiture because there is no longer even any social referent of the classical kind to lend force to effective political signs. Quite simply, there is no longer any social signified to give force to a political signifier. The only referent which still functions is that of the silent majority. All contemporary. 19. Systems function on this nebulous entity, on this floating substance whose existence is no longer social but statistical and whose only mode of appearance is that of the survey. A simulation on the horizon of the social, or rather on whose horizon the social has already disappeared. That the silent majority is an imaginary referent does not mean they don't exist. It means that their representation is no longer possible. The masses are no longer a referent because they no longer belong to the order of representation. They don't express themselves, they are surveyed. They don't reflect upon themselves, they are tested. The referendum has been substituted for the political referent. Now polls, tests, the referendum, media are devices which no longer belong to a dimension of representations, but to one of simulation. They no longer have a referent in view, but a model. Here, revolution in relation to the devices of classical sociality is complete. In all this, social meaning still flows. 20. Between one pole and another, in a dialectical structure which allows for a political stake and contradictions. Everything changes with the device of simulation. In the couple silent majority/survey for example, there is no longer any pole nor any differential term, hence no electricity of the social either. It is short-circuited by the confusing of poles, in a total circularity of signaling. This is the ideal form of simulation, collapse of poles, orbital circulation of models. Bombarded with stimuli, messages, and tests, the masses are simply an opaque, blind stratum, like those clusters of stellar gas known only through analysis of their light spectrum, radiation spectrum equivalent to statistics and surveys, but precisely, it can no longer be a question of expression or representation, but only of the simulation of an ever inexpressible and unexpressed social. This is the meaning of 21. Their silence. But this silence is paradoxical. It isn't a silence which does not speak, it is a silence which refuses to be spoken for in its name. And in this sense, far from being a form of alienation, it is an absolute weapon. No one can be said to represent the silent majority, and that is its revenge. The masses are no longer an authority to which one might refer as one formerly referred to class or to the people. Withdrawn into their silence, they are no longer subject, hence they can no longer be spoken for, articulated, represented, nor pass through the political mirror stage and the cycle of imaginary identifications. One sees what strength results from this, no longer being subject, they can no longer be alienated, neither in their own language, nor in any other which would pretend to speak for them. The end of revolutionary convictions. For these have always speculated on the possibility of the masses, or the proletariat, denying themselves as such. But the mass is not a place of negativity or explosion, it is a place of absorption and implosion. Inaccessible to schemas of liberation, revolution, and historicity, this is its mode of defense, its 22. Particular mode of retaliation. Model of simulation and imaginary referent for use by a phantom political class which now no longer knows what kind of power it wields over it, the mass is at the same time the death, the end of this political process thought to rule over it. And into it is engulfed the political as will and representation. The strategy of power has long seemed founded on the apathy of the masses. The more passive they were, the more secure it was. But this logic is only characteristic of the bureaucratic and centralist phase of power. And it is this which today turns against it, the inertia it has fostered becomes the sign of its own death. That is why it seeks to reverse its strategies, from passivity to participation, from silence to speech. But it is too late. The threshold of the critical mass, that of the involution of the social through inertia, is exceeded. 3. Everywhere the masses are encouraged to speak, they are urged to live socially, electorally, organizationally, sexually, in participation, in festival, in free speech, etc. The spectre must be exorcised, it must pronounce its name. Nothing shows more dramatically that the only genuine problem today is the silence of the mass, the 23. Silence of the silent majority. All reserves are exhausted in maintaining this mass in controlled emulsion and in preventing it from falling back into its panic-inducing inertia and its silence. No longer being under the reign of will or representation, it falls under the province of diagnosis, or divination pure and simple, whence the universal reign of information and statistics. We must auscultate it, sound it out, unearth some oracle from within it. Whence the mania for seduction, solicitude, and all the solicitation surrounding it. Whence prediction by resonance, the effects of forecasting and of an illusory mass outlook, the French people think. The majority of Germans disapprove. All England thrilled to the birth of the prince, etc. A mirror held out for an ever-blind, ever-absent recognition. Whence that bombardment of signs which the mass is thought to re-echo. It is interrogated by converging waves, by light or linguistic stimuli, exactly like distant stars or nuclei bombarded with particles in a cyclotron. Information is exactly this. Not a mode of communication or 24. Of meaning, but a mode of constant emulsion, of input-output and of controlled chain reactions, exactly as in atomic simulation chambers. We must free the energy of the mass in order to fabricate the social. But it is a contradictory process, for information and security, in all their forms, instead of intensifying or creating the social relation, are on the contrary entropic processes, modalities of the end of the social. It is thought that the masses may be structured by injecting them with information, their captive social energy is believed to be released by means of information and messages. Quite the contrary. Instead of transforming the mass into energy, information produces even more mass. Instead of informing as it claims, instead of giving form and structure, information neutralizes even further the social field, more and more it creates an inert mass impermeable to the classical institutions of the social, and to the very contents of information. Today, replacing the fission of symbolic structures by the social. 25. And its rational violence, is the fission of the social itself by the irrational violence of media and information, the final result being precisely an atomized, nuclearized, molecularized mass, the result of 2 centuries of accelerated socialization and which brings it irremediably to an end. The mass is only mass because its social energy has already frozen. It is a cold reservoir, capable of absorbing and neutralizing any hot energy. It resembles those half-dead systems into which more energy is injected than is withdrawn, those paid-out deposits exorbitantly maintained in a state of artificial exploitation. Immense energy is expended in mitigating the tendentially declining rate of political investment and the absolute fragility of the social principle of reality, in maintaining the simulation of the social and in preventing it from totally imploding. And the system risks being swallowed up by it. Basically, what goes for commodities also goes for meaning. For a long time capital only 26 had to produce goods, consumption ran by itself. Today it is necessary to produce consumers, to produce demand, and this production is infinitely more costly than that of goods. For a long time it was enough for power to produce meaning, and the demand followed, it absorbed supply and still surpassed it. Meaning was in short supply, and all the revolutionaries offered themselves to produce still more. Today, everything has changed, no longer is meaning in short supply, it is produced everywhere, in ever-increasing quantities, it is demand which is weakening. And it is the production of this demand for meaning which has become crucial for the system. Without this demand for, without this susceptibility to, without this minimal participation in meaning, power is nothing but an empty simulacrum and an isolated effect of perspective. Here, too, the production of demand is infinitely more costly than the production of meaning itself. Beyond a certain point, it is impossible, all the energy mustered by the system 27 will no longer be enough. The demand for objects and for services can always be artificially produced, at a high, but accessible cost, the system has proved this. The desire for meaning, when it is in short supply, and the desire for reality, when it is weakening everywhere, cannot be made good and together threaten total ruin. The mass absorbs all the social energy, but no longer refracts it. It absorbs every sign and every meaning, but no longer reflects them. It absorbs all messages and digests them. For every question put to it, it sends back a tautological and circular response. 5. It never participates. Inundated by flows and tests, it forms a mass or earth, it is happy to be a good conductor of flows, but of any flow, a good conductor of information, but of any information, a good conductor of norms, but of any norm, and thereby to reflect the social in its absolute transparency, to give place only to the effects of power and of the social, the latter like constellations fluctuating around this imperceptible nucleus. The mass is dumb like beasts, and its silence is equal to the silence of beasts. Despite having been surveyed to death, it says neither whether the truth is to the left or to the right, nor whether it prefers revolution or repression. It is without truth and without reason. It has been attributed with every arbitrary remark. It is without conscience and without unconscious. This silence is unbearable. It is the unknown of the political equation, the unknown which annuls every political equation. Everybody questions it, but never as silence, always to make it speak. But the inertial strength of the masses is unfathomable, literally, no sounding or survey will cause it to become evident, since their effect is to blanket it out. A silence which topples the political and the social into the hyper-reality with which we associate it. For if the political seeks to pick up the masses in a social echo or simulation chamber, it is the masses who in return become a huge echo or simulation chamber of the social. Manipulation has never existed. The game is played on both sides, with the same weapons, and who can say which is winning today, the simulation power performs on the masses, or the inverse simulation held out by the masses for power to be swallowed up in. Neither subject nor object. The mass realizes that paradox of being both an object of simulation and a subject of simulation, capable of refracting all the models and of emulating them by hypersimulation. The mass realizes that paradox of not being a subject, a group subject, but of not being an object either. Every effort to make a subject of it runs head-on into the glaring impossibility of an autonomous change in consciousness. Every effort to make an object of it, to treat and analyze it as brute matter, according to objective laws, runs head-on into the contrary fact that it is impossible to manipulate the masses in any determinate way, or to understand them in terms of elements, relations, structures, and wholes. All manipulation plunges, gets sucked into the mass, absorbed, distorted, reversibilist. 30. It is impossible to know where it goes, most likely it goes round and round in an endless cycle, foiling every intention on the part of the manipulators. No analysis would know how to contain this diffuse, disintegrated, Brownian, molecular reality. The notion of object vanishes just as matter, in the ultimate analysis, vanishes on the horizon of microphysics. It is impossible to comprehend the latter as object once that infinitesimal point is reached where the subject of observation is himself annulled. No more object of knowledge, no more subject of knowledge. The mass brings about the same insoluble boundary situation in the field of the social. No longer is it objectifiable, and it annuls any subject who would claim to comprehend it. Only surveys and statistics can account for it, but one knows that this incantation, this meteoric ritual of statistics and surveys has 31. No real object, especially not the masses whom it is thought to express. It simply simulates an elusive object, but whose absence is nevertheless intolerable. It produces it in the form of anticipated responses, of circular signals which seem to circumscribe its existence and to bear witness to its will. Floating signs, such are surveys, instantaneous signs, intended for manipulation, and whose conclusions can be interchanged. Everybody knows the profound indeterminateness which rules over statistics. Besides, it is not certain that the procedures of scientific experimentation in the so-called exact sciences have much more truthfulness than surveys and statistics. In any discipline whatsoever, the coded, controlled, objective form of inquiry only allows for this circular type of truth, from which the very object aimed at is excluded. In any case, it is possible to think that the uncertainty surrounding this enterprise of the objective determination of the world remains total and that 32. Even matter and the inanimate, when summoned to respond, in the various sciences of nature, in the same terms and according to the same procedures as the masses and social beings in statistics and surveys, also send back the same conforming signals, the same coded responses, with the same exasperating, endless conformity, only to better escape, in the last instance, exactly like the masses, any definition as object. There would thus be a fantastic irony about matter, and every object of science, just as there is a fantastic irony about the masses in their muteness, or in their statistical discourse so conforming to the questions put to them, akin to the eternal irony of femininity of which Hegel speaks, the irony of a false fidelity, of an excessive fidelity to the law, an ultimately impenetrable simulation of passivity and obedience, and which annuls in return the law governing them, in accordance with the immortal example of Soldier-Schweik. From this would follow, in the literal sense, a pataphysics, or science of imaginary solutions, a science of the simulation or hypersimulation of 33. An exact, true, objective world, with its universal laws, including the delirium of those who interpret it according to these laws. The masses and their involuntary humor would introduce us to a pataphysics of the social which ultimately would relieve us of all that cumbersome metaphysics of the social. This contradicts all received views of the process of truth, but perhaps the latter is only an illusion of judgment. The scientist cannot believe that matter, or living beings, do not respond objectively to the questions he puts, or that they respond to them too objectively for his questions to be sound. This hypothesis alone seems absurd and unthinkable to him. He will never accept it. He will never leave the enchanted and simulated circle of his inquiry. The same hypothesis applies everywhere. the same axiom of credibility. The ad man cannot but believe that people believe in it, however, slightly, that is, that a minimal probability exists of the message reaching its goal and being decoded according to its meaning. Any principle of uncertainty is excluded. If it turned out that the refractive index of this message in the recipient were nil, advertising would instantly collapse. It only surveys on that belief which it accords itself and which it doesn't try too hard to verify, in terror that the contrary hypothesis might also be true, namely that the great majority of advertising messages never reach their destination, that the viewing public no longer differentiates between the contents, which are refracted in the void. The medium alone functions as an atmospheric effect and acts as spectacle and fascination. The medium is the message, McLuhan prophesied, a formula characteristic of the present phase, the cool phase of the whole mass media culture, that of a freezing, neutralization of every message in a vacuous ether. That of a glaciation of meaning. Critical thought judges and chooses, it produces differences, it is by selection that it presides over meaning. The masses, on the other hand, do not choose, they do not produce differences but a lack of differentiation, they retain a fascination for the medium which they prefer to the critical exigencies of the message. For fascination is not dependent on meaning, it is proportional to the disaffection of meaning. It is obtained by neutralizing the message in favor of the medium, by 35. Neutralizing the idea of favor of the idol, by neutralizing the truth in favor of the simulacrum. It is at this level that the media function. Fascination is their law, and their specific violence, a massive violence denying communication by meaning in favor of another mode of communication. Which one? For us an untenable hypothesis, that it may be possible to communicate outside the medium of meaning, that the very intensity of communication may be proportional to the reabsorption of meaning and to its collapse. For it is not meaning or the increase of meaning which gives tremendous pleasure, but its neutralization which fascinates. And not by some death drive, which implies that life is still on the side of meaning, but quite simply by defiance, by an allergy to reference, to the message, to the code and to every category of the linguistic enterprise, by a repudiation of all this in favor of imploding the sign in fascination. None of the guardians of meaning 36. Can understand this, the whole morality of meaning rises up against fascination. The political sphere also only survives by a credibility hypothesis, namely that the masses are permeable to action and to discourse, that they hold an opinion, that they are present behind the surveys and statistics. It is at this price alone that the political class can still believe that it speaks and that it is politically heard. Even though the political has long been the agent of nothing but spectacle on the screen of private life. Digested as a form of entertainment, half sports, half games, like those old comedies of manners, at once both fascinating and ludicrous. For some time now, the electoral game has been akin to TV game shows in the consciousness of the people. The latter, who have always served as alibi and as supernumerary on the political stage, avenge themselves by treating as a theatrical performance the political scene and its actors. The people have become a public. It is the football match or film or cartoon which serve as models for their perception of the political sphere. The people even enjoy day to day, like a horn movie, the fluctuations of 37. Their own opinions in the daily opinion polls. Nothing in all this engages any responsibility. At no time are the masses politically or historically engaged in a conscious manner. They have only ever done so out of perversity, in complete irresponsibility. Nor is this a flight from politics, but rather the effect of an implacable antagonism between the class which bears the social, the political, culture master of time and history, and the unformed, residual, senseless mass. The former continually seeks to perfect the reign of meaning, to invest, to saturate the field of the social, the other continually distorts every effect of meaning, neutralizes or diminishes them. In this confrontation, the winner is not at all the one you might think. This can be seen in the shift in value from history to the humdrum, from the public sphere to the private sphere. Up till the 60s, history leads on the downbeat, the private, the ordinary is only the dark side of the political sphere. At best a dialectic plays between the two, and it is to be hoped that one day the ordinary, like the individual, will shine over history, in the universal. But 38. In the meantime, the withdrawal of the masses into their domestic sphere, their refuge from history, politics, and the universal, and their absorption into an idiotic humdrum existence of consumption is only to be lamented. Today, there is a reversal of the downbeat and the upbeat. One begins to foresee that ordinary life, men in their banality, could well not be the insignificant side of history. Better, that withdrawing into the private could well be a direct defiance of the political, a form of actively resisting political manipulation. The roles are reversed. It is the banality of life, everyday life, everything formerly branded as petit bourgeois, abject and apolitical, which becomes the downbeat, with history and the political unfolding their abstract eventuality elsewhere. A staggering hypothesis. The depoliticized masses would not be the side of the political, but beyond it. The private, the unamable, the ordinary, the insignificant, petty wiles, petty perversions etc., would not be the side of representation, but beyond it. In their naive practice. 39. The masses would sentence the political to annihilation. They would be spontaneously transpolitical like they are translinguistic in their language. But take care. Out of this private and a social universe, which does not enter into a dialectic of representation and of transcendence towards the universal, out of this involutive sphere which is opposed to all revolution from the top and refuses to play the game, some would like to make a new source of revolutionary energy. They would like to give it meaning and to reinstate it in its very banality, as historical negativity. Exaltation of micro-desires, small differences, unconscious practices, anonymous marginalities. Final somersault of the intellectuals to exalt insignificance, to promote nonsense into the order of sense. And to transfer it back to political reason. Banality, inertia, apoliticism used to be fascist. They are in the process of becoming revolutionary, without changing meaning, without ceasing to have meaning. Micro-revolution of banality, transpolitics of desire, one more trick of the liberationists. The denial. 40. Of meaning has no meaning. From resistance to hyperconformity. The emergence of silent majorities must be located within the entire cycle of historical resistance to the social. Resistance to work of course, but also resistance to medicine, resistance to schooling, resistance to security, resistance to information. Official history only records the uninterrupted progress of the social, relegating to the obscurity reserved for former cultures, as barbarous relics, everything not coinciding with this glorious advent. In fact, contrary to what one might believe, resistance to the social in all its forms has progressed even more rapidly than the social. It has merely taken other forms than the primitive and violent ones which were subsequently absorbed. Those frontal resistances still course. 41. Pond to an equally frontal and violent period of socialization, and Karn from traditional groups seeking to preserve their own culture, their original cultures. It was not the mass in them which resisted, but, on the contrary, differentiated structures, in opposition to the homogeneous and abstract model of the social. This type of resistance can still be discovered in the two-step flow of communication which American sociology has analyzed. The mass does not at all constitute a passive receiving structure for media messages, whether they be political, cultural, or advertising. Microgroups and individuals, far from taking their cue from a uniform and imposed decode messages in their own way. They intercept them and transpose them, contrasting the dominant code with their own particular subcodes, finally recycling everything passing into their own cycle, exactly like primitive natives recycle Western money in their symbolic circulation, or like the Corsicans recycle universal suffrage and elections in their clan rivalry strategies. This ruse is universal. It is a way of redirecting, of absorbing, of victoriously salvaging the material diff. 42. fused by the dominant culture. It is this which also governs the magic usage of the doctor and medicine among the underdeveloped masses. Commonly reduced to an antiquated and irrational mentality, we should read in this, on the contrary, an offensive practice, a reedy version by excess, an unanalyzed but conscious rejection without knowing it of the profound devastation wreaked by rational medicine. But this is still the feat of groups traditionally structured by identity and significance. Quite different is the refusal of socialization which comes from the mass, from an innumerable, unamable, and anonymous group, whose strength comes from its very destructuration and inertia. Thus, in the case of the media, traditional resistance consists of reinterpreting messages according to the group's own code and for its own ends. The masses, on the contrary, accept everything and redirect everything and block into the spectacular, without requiring any other code, without requiring any meaning, ultimately without resistance, but making everything slide into an 43. Indeterminate sphere which is not even that of nonsense, but that of overall manipulation/fascination. It has always been thought, this is the very ideology of the mass media, that it is the media which envelop the masses. The secret of manipulation has been sought in a frantic semiology of the mass media. But it has been overlooked, in this naive logic of communication, that the masses are a stronger medium than all the media, that it is the former who envelop and absorb the latter, or at least there is no priority of one over the other. The mass and the media are one single process. Mass is the message. So it is with movies, whose inventors initially dreamed of a rational, documentary, social medium, but which very quickly and permanently swung towards the imaginary. So it is with technology, science, and knowledge. Condemned to a magical practice and to a spectacular consumption, so it is with consumption itself. To their amazement, economists have never been able to rationalize consumption, the seriousness of their theory of need and the general consensus upon the discourse of utility. 44. Being taken for granted. But this is because the practice of the masses very quickly had nothing to do with needs. They have turned consumption into a dimension of status and prestige, of useless keeping up with the oneses or simulation, of potlatch which surpassed use value in every way. A desperate attempt has been made from all sides to instill into them sensible spending and functional calculation in matters of consumption, but it is hopeless. For it is by sign/value and the frantic stake in sign/value, that the masses block the economy, resist the objective imperative of needs and the rational balancing of behaviors and ends. Sign/value against use value, this is already a distortion of political economy. And let it not be said that all this ultimately profits exchange value, that is to say the system. For if the system does well out of this game, and even encourages it, this isn't the main thing, and what this slipping, this skidding initiates in the long term, already initiates, is 45. The end of the economic, cut off from all its rational definitions by the excessive, magic, spectacular, fraudulent, and nearly parodic use the masses put it to. And a social use, resistant to all pedagogies, to all socialist education, an aberrant use whereby the masses have already crossed over to the other side of political economy. They haven't waited for future revolutions nor theories which claim to liberate them by a dialectical movement. They know that there is no liberation, and that a system is abolished only by pushing it mto hyperlogic, by forcing it into an excessive practice which is equivalent to a brutal amortization. Why, oh, you want us to consume? Okay, let's consume always more, and anything whatsoever, for any useless and absurd purpose. So it is with medicine. Frontal resistance has been replaced by a more subtle form of subversion, an excessive, uncontrollable consumption of medicine, a panicked conformity to health injunctions. A fantastic escalation in medical consumption which completely corrupts the social objectives and finalities of medicine. What better way to abolish it? At present, doctors, manipulate. 46. Lated much more than they manipulate, no longer know what they are doing, what they are. Give us more treatment, doctors, medication, security, health, more, ever further, keep it coming. The masses alienated in medicine? Not at all, they are in the process of ruining its institution, of making social security explode, of putting the social itself in danger by craving always more of it, as with commodities. What greater mockery can there be than this craving for the social as an item of individual consumption, submitted to an ever-escalating supply and demand? A parody and a paradox, it is by their very inertia in the ways of the social laid out for them that the masses go beyond its logic and its limits, and destroy its whole edifice. A destructive hypersimulation, a destructive hyperconformity that has all the appearance of a victorious challenge. No one can measure the strength of this challenge, of the reversion exerted on the whole system. There lies the genuine stake today, in this underhand, inescapable confrontation between the silent majority and the social imposed on them, in this hypersimulation reduplicating simulation and exterminating it according to its 47. own logic, not in any class struggle nor in the molecular hodgepodge of desire-breaching minorities. Mass and terrorism. We are therefore at the paradoxical point where the masses refuse the baptism of the social, which is also that of meaning and liberty. Let us not make them into a new and glorious reference. For one thing, they don't exist. But note that all power silently flounders on this silent majority, which is neither an entity nor a sociological reality, but the shadow cast by power, its sinking vortex, its form of absorption. A nebulous fluid, shifting, conforming, far too conforming to every solicitation and with a hyper-real conformity which is the extreme form of non-participation, such is the present calamity of power. Such is also the calamity of revolution. For this implosive mass, by definition, will never explode and every revolutionary promise will implode into it as well. In consequence, what is to be done with these masses? They are the leitmotif of every discourse, they are the obsession of every social 48. project, but all run aground on them, for all remain rooted in the classical definition of the masses, which is that of an eschatological faith in the social and its fulfillment. Now, the masses aren't the social, they are the reversion of any social and of any socialism. Enough theorists have criticized meaning, denounced the traps of liberty and the mystifications of the political, radically censured rationality and every form of representation. However, when the masses wander through meaning, the political, representation, history, ideology, with the somnambulant strength of denial, when they realize here and now everything which the most radical critics have been able to envisage, then the latter know not what to make of it, and persist in dreaming of a future revolution, a critical revolution, a revolution of prestige, that of the social, that of desire. This revolution by involution is not theirs, it is not critical explosive, it is implosive and blind. It proceeds by inertia, and not from a new and joyous negativity. It is silent and involutive, exactly the reverse of all speech-making and consciousness-raising. It has no meaning. It has nothing to say to us. 49. Indeed, the only phenomenon which may be in a relation of affinity with it, with these masses such that the final vicissitude of the social and its death is at stake, is terrorism. Nothing is more cut off from the masses than terrorism. Power may well try to set the one against the other, but nothing is more strange, more familiar either, than their convergence in denying the social and in refusing meaning. For terrorism claims to really aim at capital, but it mistakes its enemy, and in doing so it aims at its true enemy, which is the social. Present-day terrorism aims at the social in response to the terrorism of the social. It aims at the social such as it is produced today, the orbital, interstitial, nuclear, tissual network of control and security, which invests us on all sides and produces us, all of us, as a silent majority. A hyper-real, imperceptible sociality, no longer operating by law and repression, but by the infiltration of models, no longer by violence, but by deterrence/persuasion, to that terrorism responds by an equally hyper-real act, caught up from the outset in concentric waves of media and of fascination. 50. dedicated from the outset not to any representation or consciousness, but to a mental downgrading by contiguity, fascination, and panic, not to reflection or to the logic of cause and effect, but to a chain reaction by contagion, senseless and indeterminate like the system it combats, into which it insinuates itself rather like a point of maximum and infinitesimal implosion, a non-explosive, non-historical, non-political terrorism, implosive, crystallizing, earth-shattering, and for that matter a homologue deep down, of the silence and inertia of the masses. Terrorism does not aim at making anything speak, at resuscitating or mobilizing anything, it has no revolutionary consequences, it aims at the masses in their silence, a silence mesmerized by information, it aims at that white magic of the social encircling us, that of information, of simulation, of deterrence, of anonymous and random control, in order to precipitate its death by accentuating it. It aims at that white magic of social abstraction by the black magic of a still greater, more anonymous, arbitrary, and hazardous abstraction, that of the terrorist act. 51. It is the only non-representative act. In this regard it has an affinity with the masses, who are the only non-representable reality. This is definitely not to say that terrorism would represent the silence and the not said of the masses, that it would violently express their passive resistance. It is simply to say, there is no equivalent to the blind, non-representative, senseless character of the terrorist act, but the blind, senseless, and unrepresentational behavior of the masses. What they do have in common is that they are the most radical, most intense contemporary form of the denial of the whole representative system. That is all. No one really knows what relation can be established between two elements that are outside representation. This is a problem of which our epistemology of knowledge permits no resolution, since it always postulates the medium of a subject and of a language, the medium of a representation. We are really only acquainted with representative series, we know little about analogical affinitive, immediatist, non-reference series and other systems. Undoubtedly something very substantial passes between them which we would seek in vain in the 52. Historical precedents of representative systems. And just as a positive social energy passes between the two poles of any representative system, it could be said that between the masses and terrorism, between these two non-poles of a non-representative system, also passes an energy, but a reverse energy, an energy not of social accumulation and transformation, but of social dispersal, of dispersion of the social, of absorption and annulment of the political. It cannot be said that it is the age of the silent majority which produces terrorism. It is the simultaneity of the two which is staggering, and noteworthy. Whether or not one accepts its brutality, it alone truly marks the end of the political and of the social. It alone betrays this reality of a violent implosion of all our systems of representation. Terrorism does not at all aim at unmasking the repressive character of the state. It propagates, by its own non-representativity, and by chain reaction the apparent non-representativity of all power. Here is its subversion. It precipitates non-representation by injecting it in infinitesimal but very concentrated doses. Its fundamental violence is to deny all the institutions of representation, including those who play at solidarity with it, for solidarity is still a way of constituting it as model, as emblem, and hence of assigning it to representation. Any means will do to impose meaning, to disregard how far terrorism is without legitimacy, without political consequences, without any historical continuity. Its only ripples are precisely not an historical flow but its story, its shockwave in the media. This story no more belongs to an objective and informative order than terrorism does to the political order. Both are elsewhere, in an order which is neither of meaning nor of representation, mythical perhaps, simulacrum undoubtedly. The other aspect of terrorist violence is its 54. Disclaiming of any determination and of any quality. In this sense, we must distinguish terrorism from banditry and commando action. The latter is an act of war aimed at a determinate enemy. The other is dependent on traditional criminal violence. All these actions have an economic or martial objective. Present-day terrorism, initiated by the taking of hostages and the game of postponed death, no longer has any objectives, nor any determinate enemy. Do the Palestinians strike at Israel by means of intermediary hostages? No, it is through Israel as intermediary that they strike at a mythical, or not even mythical, anonymous, undifferentiated enemy, a kind of omnipresent global social order, whenever, whoever, down to the last of the innocents. Terrorism is this: it is novel, and insoluble, only because it strikes wherever, whenever, whoever, otherwise it would only be ransom or a military commando act. Its blindness is the exact 55. Replica of the system's absolute lack of differentiation. For some time the system has no longer separated ends from means, tormentors from victims. In its deadly and indiscriminate taking of hostages, terrorism strikes at precisely the most characteristic product of the whole system, the anonymous and perfectly undifferentiated individual, the term substitutable for any other. Paradoxically, it seems that the innocent pay the crime of being nothing, of being lotless, of having been dispossessed of their name by an equally anonymous system whose purest incarnation they then become. They are the end products of the social, of a now globalist abstract sociality. It is in this sense, in the sense in which they are precisely anybody, that they are the predestined victims of terrorism. It is in this sense, or rather in this defiance of sense, that the terrorist act is akin to the natural catastrophe. There is no difference between an earthquake in Guatemala and the hijacking of a Lufthansa Boeing with 300 passengers on board, between the natural intervention and 56. The human terrorist intervention. Nature is terrorist, as is the abrupt failure of the whole technological system. The great New York blackouts create more wonderful terrorist situations than the true ones, dream situations. Better, these great technological accidents, like great natural accidents, illustrate the possibility of a radical subjectless subversion. The power failure of 77 in New York could have been instigated by a very organized terrorist group, that would have changed nothing in its objective outcome. The same acts of violence, of pillage, the same undermining, the same suspension of the social order would have ensued from it. This signifies that terrorism is not a step of violence, but is everywhere in the normality of the social, such that from one moment to the next it can be transfigured into an inverse, absurd, uncontrollable reality. The natural catastrophe acts in this sense, and so, paradoxically, it becomes the mythical expression of the catastrophe of the social. Or rather, the natural catastrophe being a meaningless, non-representative vicissitude par excellence, it becomes a kind of symptom or violent incarnation of the state of the social, namely of its catastrophe and of the collapse of every representation supporting it. Implosive systems, explosive systems. In their triangular affinity, the masses, the media, and terrorism describe the presently prevailing process of implosion. The whole process is affected by a violence which is only just beginning, an orbital and nuclear violence of intake and fascination, a violence of the void. For us today, implosion can only be violent and catastrophic because it comes from the failure of the system of explosion and of organized expansion which has predominated in the West now for a few centuries. Implosion is not necessarily a catastrophic process. In a subdued and controlled form, it has even been the main secret of primitive entradi. 58. Tional societies. Not expansive or centrifugal configurations, but centripetal ones, singular pluralities never directed towards the universal, but centered about a cyclic process, ritual, and tending to involve in a non-representative, unauthoritarian process, without any disjunctive polarity, yet without caving in on themselves either. Thus primitive societies have survived by a controlled implosion. They died as soon as they ceased to control this process, and switched over to one of explosion. Conversely, our modern civilizations have existed on a base of expansion and explosion at all levels, under the sign of universalist. 59. Commerce, of economic and philosophical investments, under the sign of universal law and conquest. Undoubtedly even they have known how to survive, for a time at least, on a controlled explosion, on a liberation of subdued and progressive energy, and this was the golden age of their culture. But, according to a process of boom and acceleration, this explosive process has become uncontrollable, it has acquired a fatal speed or amplitude, or rather it has reached the limits of the universal, it has saturated the field of possible expansion and, just as primitive societies were ravaged by explosion for not knowing how to curb the implosive process any longer, so our culture begins to be ravaged by implosion for not having known how to curb and equilibrate the explosive process. Implosion is inevitable, and every effort to save the principles of reality, of accumulation, of universality, the principles of evolution which extol expanding systems, is archaic, regressive or nostalgic. Including all those who want to free libidinal energies, plural energies, fragmentary intensities, etc. The molecular revolution only represents the final stage of liberation of energy up to the in 60 finitesimal boundaries of the field of expansion which has been that of our culture. The infinitesimal attempt of desire succeeding the infinite attempt of capital. The molecular solution succeeding the molar investment of spaces and the social. The final sparks of the explosive system, the final attempt to still control an energy of confines, or to shrink the confines of energy so as to save the principle of expansion and of liberation. But nothing will halt the implosive process, and the only remaining alternative is between a violent or catastrophic implosion, and a smooth implosion, an implosion in slow motion. There are traces of the latter, of various attempts to control new impulses which are anti-universalist, anti-representative, tribal, centripetal, etc., communes, ecology, ZPG, drugs, all of these undoubtedly belong to this order. But we must not delude ourselves about a smooth transition. It is doomed to be short-lived and to fail. There has been no balanced transition from implosive systems to explosive systems, this has always happened violently, and there is every chance that our passage towards implosion may also be violent and catastrophic. 61. The social is not a clear and unequivocal process. Do modern societies correspond to a process of socialization or to one of progressive desocialization? Everything depends on one's understanding of the term, and none of these is fixed, all are reversible. Thus the institutions which have signposted the advance of the social, including capital, which was undoubtedly the most effective socialization medium of all, could be said to produce and destroy the social in one and the same movement. If the social is formed out of abstract instances which are laid down one after the other on the ruins of the symbolic and ceremonial edifice of former societies, then these institutions produce more and more of them. But at 65. The same time they consecrate that ravenous, all-consuming abstraction which perhaps devours precisely the essential marrow of the social. From that point of view, it could be said that the social regresses to the same degree as its institutions develop. The process accelerates and reaches its maximal extent with mass media and information. Media, information, all information, act in two directions. Outwardly they produce more of the social, inwardly they neutralize the social relations and the social itself. But then, if the social is both destroyed by what produces it and reabsorbed by what it produces, it follows that its definition is empty, and that this term which serves as universal alibi for every discourse, no longer analyses anything, no longer designates anything. Not only is it superfluous and useless, wherever it appears it conceals something else, defiance, death, seduction, ritual, repetition, it conceals that it is only abstraction and residue, or even simply an effect of the social, a simulation and an illusion. Even the term social relation is enigmatic. What is a social relation? What is the production of social relations? Here everything is spurious. Is the social instantaneously, and as if by definition, a relation, which already presupposes a serious abstraction and a rational algebra of the social, or else is it something different from what the term relation neatly rationalizes? Does the social relation perhaps exist for something different, namely for what it destroys? Does it perhaps ratify, perhaps inaugurate the end of the social? The social sciences came to consecrate this obviousness and agelessness of the social. But we must change our tune. There were societies without the social, just as there were societies without history. Networks of symbolic ties were precisely neither relational nor social. At the other extreme, our society is perhaps in the process of putting an end to the social, of burying the social beneath a simulation of the social. There are many ways for it to die, as many as there are definitions. Perhaps the social will have had only an ephemeral existence, in the narrow gap between the symbolic formations and our society where it is dying. Before, there is not yet. 67. Any social, after, there is no longer any. Only sociology can seem to testify to its agelessness, and the supreme gibberish of the social sciences will still echo it long after its disappearance. For 2 centuries now, the uninterrupted energy of the social has come from deterritorialization and from concentration in ever more unified agencies. A centralist perspective space which orientates everything inserted into it by simple convergence along the line of flight towards infinity. The social can only be defined from this panoptic point of view. But let us not forget that this perspective space is only one simulation model among others, and that it is characterized only by the fact that it gives rise to effects of truth, of objectivity, unknown and unheard of in the other models. Perhaps, even this is only a delusion? In which case everything that has been contrived and staged in this comedy of errors of the social has never had any deep significance. Ultimately, things have never functioned socially, but symbolically, magically, irrationally, etc. Which I'm. 68. Plies the formula, capital is a defiance of society. That is to say that this perspective, this panoptic machine, this machine of truth, of rationality, of productivity which is capital, is without objective finality, without reason, it is above all a violence, and this violence is perpetrated by the social on the social, but basically it is not a social machine, it doesn't care a damn about capital or likewise about the social in their equally interdependent and antagonistic definition. This is to say, once more, that there is no contract is ever exchanged between distinct agencies according to the law, that is all sound and fury, there are only ever stakes, defiances, that is to say something which does not proceed via a social relation. That the other is forced into a never equivalent, ever escalating response. Defiance always comes from that which has no meaning, no name, no identity, it is a defiance of meaning, of power, of truth, of their existing as such, of their pretending to exist as such. Only this reversion can put an end to power, to meaning, to value, and never any relation of force, however favorable it is, since the latter re-enters into a polar, binary, structural relation, which recreates by definition a new space of meaning and of power. 7. Here several hypotheses are possible. 1. The social has basically never existed. There never has been any social relation. Nothing has ever functioned socially. On this inescapable basis of challenge, seduction and 70. Death, there has never been anything but simulation of the social and the social relation. In which case, there is no point dreaming about a real sociality, a hidden sociality, an ideal socialist, this just hypostatises a simulacrum. If the social is a simulation, the only likely turn of events is that of a brutal dissimulation, the social ceasing to take itself as a space of reference and to play the game, and putting an end at last to power, to the effect of power and to the mirror of the social which perpetuates it. A dissimulation which itself captures the style of a challenge to the belief that capital and power exist according to their own logic, they have none, they vanish as apparatuses as soon as the simulation of social space is undone. 8. This is really what we are seeing today, the disintegration of the whole idea of the social, the consumption and involution of the social, the breakdown of the social simulacrum, a genuine defiance of the constructive and productive approach to the social which dominates us. All quite suddenly, as if the social had never existed. A breakdown which has all the features of a catastrophe, not an evolution or revolution. No longer a crisis of the social. 71. But the reabsorption of its system. Without having anything to do with those marginal defections, which, on the contrary, supply new energy to the failing social. This reabsorption process can no longer be re-socialist. Like a ghost at dawn, its principle of reality and of social rationality simply fades away. 2. The social has really existed, it exists even more and more, it invests everything, it alone exists. Far from being volatilized, it is the social which triumphs, the reality of the social is imposed everywhere. But, contrary to the antiquated idea which makes the social into an objective progress of mankind, everything which escapes it being only residue, it is possible to envisage that the social itself is only residue, and that, if it has triumphed in the real, it is precisely as such. Litter piling up from the symbolic order as it blows around, it is the social as remainder which has assumed real force and which is soon to be universal. 9. Here is a more subtle form of death. In this event, we are really even deeper in the social, even deeper in pure excrement, in the fan. 72. Tastic congestion of dead labor, of dead and institutionalist relations within terrorist bureaucracies, of dead languages and grammars. Then of course it can no longer be said that the social is dying, since it is already the accumulation of death. In effect we are in a civilization of the supersocial, and simultaneously in a civilization of non-degradable, indestructible residue, piling up as the social spreads. Waste and recycling, such would be the social in the image of a production whose cycle has long escaped the social finalities to become a completely described spiral nebula, rotating and expanding with every revolution it makes. Thus one sees the social expanding throughout history as a rational control of residues, and a rational production of residues. 1544 saw the opening of the first great poorhouse in Paris, vagrants, lunatics, the sick, everyone not integrated by the group and discarded as remainders were taken in charge under the emerging sign of the social. This was extended. 73. To the dimensions of national assistance in the 19th century, then social security in the 20th century. Proportional to the reinforcement of social reason, it is the whole community which soon becomes residual and hence, by one more spiral, the social which piles up. When the remainders reach the dimensions of the whole of society, one has a perfect socialization. 10. Everybody is completely excluded and taken in charge, completely disintegrated and socialized. Symbolic integration is replaced by a functional integration, functional institutions take charge of the residue from symbolic disintegration, a social agency appears where there was none, nor even any name for it. Social relations fester, proliferate, grow proportionately richer with this disintegration. And the social sciences cap it off. Whence the piquancy of an expression like, the responsibility of society vis-a-vis its underprivileged members, when we know the social is precisely the agency which arises from this dereliction. Whence the interest of Le Monde's society column where paradoxically only immigrants. 74. Delinquents, women, etc. appear, precisely those who have not been socialized, the social case being analogous to the pathological case. Pockets to be absorbed, segments which the social isolates the more it spreads. Designated as refuse on the horizon of the social, they thus fall under its jurisdiction and are fated to find their place in a widening sodality. It is on these remainders that the social machine starts up again and finds support for a new extension. But what happens when everybody is socialized? Then the machine stops, the dynamic is reversed, and it is the whole social system which becomes residue. As the social progressively gets rid of all of its residue, it becomes residual itself. By placing residual categories under the rubric society, the social designates itself as remainder. Now what becomes of the rationality of the social, of the contract and of the social relation if the social, instead of appearing as original structure, appears as refuse, and refuses processing. If the social is only remains, it is no longer the scene of a positive process or history, it is simply the scene of a piling up and exorbitant processing of. 75. Death. It no longer makes any sense, since it is there for something else, in despair of anything else, it is excremental. Without any ideal perspective. For remains are the transcendence of nothingness, they are what is irreconcilable in death, and on them can only be founded a politics of death. Reclusion or preclusion. Under the sign of productive reason, the social has been above all the space of a great reclusion, under the sign of simulation and deterrence it has become the space of a great preclusion. But perhaps that is already no longer a social space. It is from the point of view of this administration of refuse that the social can appear today for what it really is, a right, a need, a service, a use value pure and simple. No longer a conflictual, political structure, but a welcoming structure. The limit of the economist value of the social as use value is in effect its ecologist value as niche. The proper use of the social as one of the ways of balancing the exchanges between the individual and his environment, the social as functional ecosystem, homeostasis and superbiology of the species, no longer even a structure, but a substance, the cordial and high-protein anonymity of a nutritious substance. A kind of fetal. 76. Security space helping everywhere to relieve the difficulties of living, providing everywhere for the quality of life, like comprehensive insurance, the equivalent of a wasted life, a degraded form of lubricating, insuring, pacifying and permissive sociality, the lowest form of social energy, that of an environmental, behavioral utility. Such is the face of the social for us, its entropic form, the other face of its death. The functional ventilation of remainders. The social exists to look after the soaking up of excess wealth which, redistributed to all and sundry, would ruin the social order, would create an intolerably utopian situation. This reversion of wealth, of all wealth, which formerly was effected by sacrifice which left no room for any accumulation of remainders, is intolerable to our societies. It is by this very fact that they are societies, in the sense that they always produce a surplus, remainders, whether it be demographic, economic, or linguistic, and that these remainders must be cleared up. The social exists on the double basis of the production of remainders and their eradication. If all wealth were sacrificed, people would lose a sense of the real. If all wealth became disposable, people would lose a sense of the useful and the useless. The social exists to take care of the useless consumption of remainders so that individuals can be assigned to the useful management of their lives. Use and use value constitute a fundamental ethics. But it exists only in a simulation of shortage and calculation. If all wealth was redistributed, of itself this would abolish use value. It would suddenly and brutally become clear that use value is only a cruel and disillusioning moral convention, which presupposes a functional calculation in all things. But it dominates us all and, intoxicated as we are by the phantasm of use value, we could not bear this catastrophe of reversing wealth and of reversing death. It is not that everything should be reversed, just that the remainder should be. And the social is what takes. 78. Care of remainders. Up till now the car and the house, and various commodities have somehow or other succeeded in soaking up the disposable physical and mental capacities of individuals. What would happen if all disposable wealth was redistributed amongst them? Quite simply, the bottom would drop out of their lives, they would lose the fabric and even tempo of a well-tempered economy, lose a sense of self-interest and of purpose. A brutal disequilibrium of the value system would result. Or else, as in the affluent society, they would be reduced to a pathological multiplication of use value where in any case this dissipates into a hyper-real functionalism. All surplus is capable of ruining the system of equivalences, if it is disproportionately poured back into it, and of driving our mental system of equivalences to despair at the same time. L1 Hence there is a kind of wisdom in the institution of the social as a matrix preventing the growth and reversion of wealth, as a medium for its controlled squandering. In a society incapable of total reversion and 79. Committed to use value, there is a kind of intelligence and wisdom in the institution of the social and of its objective wastefulness, prestige operations, Concord, the moon, missiles, satellites, even public works and social security in their absurd one-upmanship. An implicit understanding of the stupidity and the limits of use value. The true artlessness is that of socialists and humanists of every shade who want all wealth to be redistributed and that there should be no useless expenditure, etc. Socialism, the champion of use value, the champion of the use value of the social, reveals a total misunderstanding of the social. It believes that the social can become the optimal collective management of the use value of men and things. But the social is never that. Despite any socialist longing, it is insane, uncontrollable, a monstrous protuberance, which expends, which destroys, without any thought to optimal management. And it is precisely in this way that it is functional, that it fulfills its role. This is, to maintain a contrario the principle of use value, to save the reality principle by the roundabout but objective route of wastefulness. The social manufactures this privation necessary to the distinction between good and evil, and to the whole moral order in general, a privation absent from the first affluent societies described by Marshall Sahlins. This is what socialism does not see, and why, by wanting to abolish this privation and insisting on a generalist access to wealth, it puts an end to the social while believing that it is heightening it. From this point of view the problem of the death of the social is simple: the social dies from an extension of use value which is equivalent to its extermination. When everything, including the social, becomes use value, it is a world become inert, where the reverse of what Marx dreamed occurs. He dreamed of the economic being reabsorbed into a social. What is happening to us is the social being reabsorbed into a political economy, administration pure and simple. It is the wrong use of wealth which saves a society. Nothing has changed since Mandeville and his fable of the bees. And socialism can do nothing to prevent it. The whole of political economy has been invented to dissolve this paradox, this maleficent ambiguity of the social functioning. But it has always come to grief, by a 81 sort of secondary functionality. Or else, it is in the process of succeeding and, after having seen the abolition of the political and its dilution in the social, we are in the process of seeing the reabsorption of the social back into the economic, an economy even more political, and lacking in hubris, an economy of extravagance and excess which would still characterize the capitalist age. J. 3. The social has well and truly existed, but does not exist anymore. It has existed as coherent space, as reality principle, the social relation, the production of social relations, the social as dynamic abstraction, scene of conflicts and historical contradictions, the social as structure and as stake, as strategy and as ideal. All this has had an end in view, all this has meant something. The social has not always been a delusion, as in the first hypothesis, nor remainder, as in the second. But precisely, it has only had an end in view, a meaning as power, as work, as capital, from the perspective space of a rational distribution, from the finalized space of an ideal convergence, which is also that of production, in short, in the narrow gap of second 82 order simulacra, and, absorbed into third-order simulacra, it is dying. End of the perspective space of the social. The rational sociality of the contract, dialectical sociality gives way to the sociality of contact, of the circuit and transistorized network of millions of molecules and particles maintained in a random gravitational field, magnetized by the constant circulation and the thousands of tactical combinations which electrify them. But is it still a question of the socius? Where is sociality in Los Angeles? And where will it be later on, in a future generation, that of a total dissemination, of a ventilation of individuals as terminals of information, in an even more measurable, not convergent, but connected, space, a space of connection. The social only exists in a perspective space, it dies in the space of simulation, which is also a space of deterrence. The space of simulation confuses the real. 83. With the model, there is no longer any critical and speculative distance between the real and the rational. There is no longer really even any projection of models in the real, but an in the field, here and now transfiguration of the real into model. A fantastic short circuit, the real is hyper-realized. Neither realized, nor idealized, but hyper-realized. The hyper-real is the abolition of the real not by violent destruction, but by its assumption, elevation to the strength of the model. Anticipation, deterrence, preventive transfiguration, etc., the model acts as a sphere of absorption of the real. That is clear in some of its subtle, tenuous, imperceptible features, by which the real appears as more true than the true, as too real to be true. The task of all media and information today is to produce this real, this extra real. There is too much of it, we fall into obscenity and porn. As in porn, a kind of zoom takes us too near the real one, which never existed and only ever came into view at a certain distance. Deterrence of all real potent. 84. Tiley, deterrence by meticulous reduplication, by macroscopic hyperfidelity, by accelerated recycling, by saturation and obscenity, the abolition of the distance between the real and its representation, by implosion of the differentiated poles between which flowed the energy of the real, this hyperreality puts an end to the system of the real, it puts an end to the real as referential by exalting it as model. It also puts an end to the social in the same way. The social, if it existed with second-order simulacra, no longer even has the opportunity to be produced with third-order ones, from the beginning it is trapped in its own blown-up and desperate staging, in its own obscenity. Signs of this hyper-realization of the social, signs of its reduplication and its anticipated fulfillment are everywhere. The transparency of the social relation is flaunted, signified, consumed everywhere. The history of the social will never have had time to lead to revolution, it will have been outstripped by signs of the social and of revolution. The social will never have had time to lead to socialism, it will have been short-circuited by the hypersocial, by the hyper-reality of the social. Thus the 85. Proletariat will not have even had time to deny itself as such, the concept of class will have dissolved well before, into some parodic, extended double, like the mass of workers or simply into a retrospective simulation of the proletariat. Thus, even before political economy leads to its dialectical overthrow, to the resolution of all needs and to the optimal organization of things, before it would have been able to see whether there was any basis to all that, it will have been captivated by hyperreality of the economy. Nothing has corn to the end of its history, or will henceforth any more, for nothing escapes this precession of simulacra. And the social itself has died before having given up its secret. 12. Nevertheless, let us tenderly recall the unbelievable naivete of social and socialist thinking, for thus having been able to refi as universal and to elevate as ideal of transparency such a totally ambiguous and contradictory, worse, such a residual or imaginary, worse, such an already abolished in its very simulation, reality, the social. 86. The implosion of meaning in the media. We are in a universe where there is more and more information, and less meaning. Consider three hypotheses. 1. Either information produces meaning, but doesn't succeed in compensating for the brutal loss of signification in every domain. The reinjection of message and content by means of the media is vain, since meaning is devoured and lost more rapidly than it is reinjected. In this case, appeal has to be made to a productivity at the base in order to relieve the failing media. This is the whole ideology of free speech, of the media subdivided into innumerable individual cells of transmission, indeed anti-media. 2. Or information has nothing to do with signification. It is something else, an operational model of another order, outside of meaning and 95. The circulation of meaning properly speaking. This is the hypothesis of Shannon, a sphere of information that is purely instrumental, a technical medium implying no end purpose of meaning, and thus which must not itself be implicated in a value judgment. A kind of code, perhaps like the genetic code, it is what it is, it functions as it does, meaning is something else, corning afterwards in some way, as in Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity. In this case, there would simply be no significant relation between the inflation of information and the deflation of meaning. 3. Or rather the contrary, there is a rigorous and necessary correlation between the two, to the extent that information is directly destructive of meaning and signification, or neutralizes it. The loss of meaning is directly linked to the dissolving and dissuasive action of information, the media, and the mass media. The third hypothesis is the most interesting, although it goes against the grain of all accepted opinion. Everywhere socialization is measured according to exposure through media messages. Those who are underexposed to the media are virtually asocial or desocialized. Everywhere in 96. Formation is reputed to produce an accelerated circulation of meaning, a plus value of meaning homologous to the economic plus value which results from the accelerated rotation of capital. Information is given as creative of communication, and even if the wastage is enormous, a general consensus would have it that there is in the total nonetheless a surplus of meaning, which is redistributed in all the interstices of the social fabric, just as a consensus would have it that material production, despite its dysfunctions and irrationalities, nevertheless leads to an excess of wealth and social finality. We are all accomplices in this myth. It is the alpha and omega of our modernity, without which the credibility of our social organization would collapse. Yet the fact is that it is collapsing, and for this very reason. Just where we think that information is producing meaning, it is doing the exact opposite. Information devours its own contents, it devours communication and the social, and for two reasons. 1. Instead of causing communication, it houses itself in the act of staging the communication. Instead of producing meaning, it exhausts itself in the staging of meaning. It is a gigantic process of simulation with which we are very familiar. The non-directed interview, speech, listeners who telephone in, participation at all levels, blackmail through speech, all say, "It's your concern, you are the event," etc. More and more information is invaded by this sort of phantom content, this homeopathic graft, this awakened dream of communication. It is a circular setup in which the desire of the audience is put on stage, an amphitheater of communication, which, as we know, is never anything but the recycling in the negative of traditional institutions, the integrated circuit of the negative. Immense energies are deployed in order to keep the simulacre standing upright, and to avoid the brutal dissimulation which would confront us with the obvious reality of a radical loss of meaning. It is useless to wonder if it is the loss of communication which causes this escalation in the simulacre, or if it is the simulacre which is there first, with its dissuasive finality, since it short-circuits in advance all possibility of communication. It is useless to wonder which is the first term. There is none, it is a secular process, that of simulation, that of the hyperreal, a hyperreality of communication and of meaning, more real than the real. Hence the real is abolished. Thus communication as well as the social functions as a closed circuit, as a lure, to which is attached the force of a myth. The belief and the faith in information attached to this tautological proof give the system itself, by doubling its signs, an unlocatable reality. But this belief may be thought to be as ambiguous as the one attached to myths in archaic societies. One both believes and doesn't believe. The question is simply not posed. I know very well, but all the same. A sort of inverted simulation corresponds in the masses, in each one of us, to this simulation of meaning and of communication in which the system encloses us. To the tautology of the system the masses have responded with ambivalence, to dissuasion they have responded with disaffection, and an always enigmatic belief. The myth exists, but one must guard against thinking that people believe in it. That is the trap of critical thought, which can 99. Only be exercised given the naivete and the stupidity of the masses as a presupposition. 2. Behind this exacerbated staging of communication, the mass media, with its pressure of information, carries out an irresistible destructuration of the social. Thus information dissolves meaning and the social into a sort of nebulous state, leading not at all to a surfeit of innovation but to the very contrary, to total entropy. 1. Thus the media do not bring about socialization, but just the opposite, the implosion of the social in the masses. And this is only the macroscopic extension of the implosion of meaning at the microscopic level of the sign. The latter is to be analyzed starting from McLuhan's formula: the medium is the message, the consequences of which are far from being exhausted. Its meaning is that all the contents of meaning are absorbed in the dominant form of the medium. The medium alone makes the event, and does this whatever the contents, whether conformist or subversive. A serious problem for 100. All counter-information, pirate radios, anti-media, etc. But there is something even more serious, which McLuhan himself did not make clear. For beyond this neutralization of all content, one could still hope to manipulate the medium in its form, and to transform the real by utilizing the impact of the medium as form. With all content nullified, perhaps there is still a revolutionary and subversive use value of the medium as such. Yet, and this is where McLuhan's formula at its extreme limit leads, there is not only the implosion of the message in the medium, in the same movement there is the implosion of the medium itself in the real, the implosion of the medium and the real in a sort of nebulous hyperreality where even the definition and the distinct action of the medium are no longer distinguishable. Even the traditional status of the media themselves, characteristic of our modernity, is put into question. McLuhan's formula, the medium is the message, which is the key formula of the era of simulation. 101. This very formula must be envisaged at its limit, where, after all contents and messages have been volatilized in the medium, it is the medium itself which is volatilized as such. At bottom, it is still the message which lends credibility to the medium, and which gives to the medium its distinct and determined status as intermediary of communication. Without a message, the medium also falls into that indefinite state characteristic of all our great systems of judgment and value. A single model, whose efficacy is immediacy, simultaneously generates the message, the medium, and the real. In short, the medium is the message signifies not only the end of the message, but also the end of the medium. There are no longer media in the literal sense of the term, that is to say, a power mediating between one reality and another, between one state of the real and another, neither in content nor in form. Strictly speaking, this is what implosion signifies, the absorption of one pole into another, the short circuit between poles of every differential system of meaning, the effacement of terms and of 102 distinct oppositions, and thus that of the medium and the real. Hence the impossibility of any mediation, of any dialectical intervention between the two or from one to the other, circularity of all media effects. Hence the impossibility of a sense, in the literal sense of a unilateral vector which leads from one pole to another. This critical, but original, situation must be thought through to the very end, it is the only one we are left with. It is useless to dream of a revolution through content or through form, since the medium and the real are now in a single nebulous state whose truth is undecipherable. The fact of this implosion of contents, of absorption of meaning, of the evanescence of the medium itself, of the reabsorption of the whole dialectic of communication in a total circularity of the model, of the implosion of the social in the masses, can appear catastrophic and hopeless. But it is only so in regard to the idealism that dominates our whole vision of information. We all live by a fanatical idealism of meaning and communication, by an idealism of communication through meaning, and, in this perspective, it is very much a catastrophe of meaning which lies in wait for us. 103. but it must be seen that the term catastrophe has this catastrophic meaning of the end and annihilation only in a linear vision of accumulation and productive finality that the system imposes on us. Etymologically, the term only signifies the curvature, the winding down to the bottom of a cycle leading to what can be called the horizon of the event, to the horizon of meaning, beyond which we cannot go. Beyond it, nothing takes place that has meaning for us, but it suffices to exceed this ultimatum of meaning in order that catastrophe itself no longer appear as the last, nihilistic day of reckoning, such as it functions in our current collective fantasy. Beyond meaning, there is fascination, which results from the neutralization and implosion of meaning. Beyond the horizon of the social, there are the masses, which result from the neutralization and implosion of the social. The essential thing today is to evaluate this double challenge, the defiance of meaning by the masses and their silence, and the defiance of meaning which comes from the media and its fascination. In regard to this challenge, all the marginal and alternative attempts to resuscitate meaning 104 are secondary. Evidently there is a paradox in this inextricable conjunction of the masses and the media. Is it the media that neutralizes meaning and that produces the unformed mass, or is it the mass that victoriously resists the media by diverting or absorbing all the messages which it produces without responding to them? Some time ago, in Requiem for the Media, I analyzed the media as the institution of an irreversible model of communication without response. But today, this absence of response can be understood as a counter-strategy of the masses themselves in their encounter with power, and no longer at all as a strategy of power. What then? Are the mass media on the side of power in the manipulation of the masses, or are they on the side of the masses in the liquidation of meaning, in the violence done to meaning and in the fascination that results? Is it the media which induce fascination in the masses, or is it the masses which divert the media into spectacle? Mogadishu Stamheim, the media are made the 105 vehicle of the moral condemnation of terrorism and of the exploitation of fear for political ends, but, simultaneously, in the most total ambiguity, they propagate the brutal fascination of the terrorist act. They are themselves terrorists, to the extent to which they work through fascination. The media carry meaning and nonsense, they manipulate in every sense simultaneously. The process cannot be controlled, for the media convey the simulation internal to the system and the simulation destructive of the system according to a logic that is absolutely Mobian and circular, and this is exactly what it is like. There is no alternative to it, no logical resolution. Only a logical exacerbation and a catastrophic resolution. With one qualification. We are face to face with this system, in a double situation, an insoluble double bind exactly like children face to face with the adult universe. They are simultaneously summoned to behave like autonomous subjects. 106. Responsible, free, and conscious, and as submissive objects, inert, obedient, and conforming. The child resists on all levels, and to a contradictory demand he also responds with a double strategy. To the demand to be an object, he opposes all the practices of disobedience, revolt, emancipation, in short, a total claim to subjecthood. To the demand to be a subject, he opposes just as stubbornly and efficaciously with an object's resistance, that is to say, in exactly the opposite manner, infantilism, hyperconformism, a total dependence, passivity, idiocy. Neither of the two strategies has more objective value than the other. The resistance as subject is today unilaterally valorized and held as positive, just as in the political sphere only the practices of liberation, emancipation, expression, and constitution as a political subject are taken to be valuable and subversive. But this is to ignore the equal or perhaps even superior impact, of all the practices as object, the renunciation of the position of subject and of meaning, exactly the practices of the masses, which we bury and forget under the contemptuous terms of alienation and passivity. The liberating practices respond to one of the aspects of the system, to the 107 constant ultimatum to make of ourselves pure objects, but they don't respond at all to the other demand, which is to constitute ourselves as subjects, to liberate ourselves, to express ourselves at any price, to vote, produce, decide, speak, participate, play the game, a form of blackmail and ultimatum just as serious as the other, probably even more serious today. To a system whose argument is oppression and repression, the strategic resistance is the liberating claim of subjecthood. But this reflects rather the system's previous phase, and even if we are still confronted with it, it is no longer the strategic terrain. The system's current argument is the maximization of the word and the maximal production of meaning. Thus the strategic resistance is that of a refusal of meaning and a refusal of the word, or of the hyperconformist simulation of the very mechanisms of the system, which is a form of refusal and of non-reception. This is the resistance of the masses. It is equivalent to sending back to the system its own logic by doubling it, to reflecting, like a mirror, meaning without absorbing it. This strategy prevails today. 108. Because it was ushered in by that phase of the system. A mistake concerning strategy is a serious matter. All the movements which only bet on liberation, emancipation, the resurrection of the subject of history, of the group, of speech as a raising of consciousness, indeed of a seizure of the unconscious of subjects and of the masses, do not see that they are acting in accordance with the system, whose imperative today is the overproduction and regeneration of meaning and speech. Arthiat of cruelty. I Mogadishu. In the terrorist act there is a simultaneous power of death and simulation which it is intolerable to see confused with the morbid taste of death, and with the frenzy of the morbid and the spectacular. Dead or living, it is elsewhere that terrorism wins out. At least by this single fact, it alone makes the event, and thus returns the whole political order to its nullity. And the media, all while orchestrating the victory of order, only cause the evidence for the opposite to reverberate, to wit, that terrorism is burying the political order. The media are terrorists in their own fashion, working continually to produce sense, but, at the same time, violently. 113. Defeating it by arousing everywhere a fascination without scruples, that is to say, a paralysis of meaning, to the profit of a single scenario. Terrorism is not violent in itself, only the spectacle it unleashes is truly violent. It is our theater of cruelty, the only one that remains to us, perhaps equal in every respect to that of Artaud or to that of the Renaissance, and extraordinary in that it brings together the spectacular and the challenge at their highest points. It is at the same time a model of simulation, a micro-model flashing with a minimally real event and a maximal echo chamber, like a crystal thrown into an unstable solution or an experimental matrix, an insoluble equation which makes all the variables appear suddenly. Not a real event, but a condensed narrative, a flash, a scenario, that is to say, that which opposes to every event said to be real the purest form of the spectacular, and a ritual, or that which, of all possible events, opposes to the political and historical model or order the purest symbolic form of challenge. A strange mixture of the symbolic and the spectacular, of challenge and simulation. This 114. Paradoxical configuration is the only original form of our time, and subversive because insoluble. There is neither victory nor defeat, no sense can be made of an event which is irremediably spectacular, or irremediably symbolic. Everything in terrorism is ambivalent and reversible: death, the media, violence, victory. Who plays into the other's hands? Death itself is undefinable. The death of the terrorists is equivalent to that of the hostages, they are substitutable. In spite of all the efforts to set them into radical opposition, fascination allows no distinction to be made, and rightly so, for power finally does not make any either, but settles its accounts with everyone, and buries Bader and Schleyer together at Stuttgart in its incapacity to unravel the depths and rediscover the fine dividing line, the distinctive and valid oppositions which are the secret of law and order. Nor is it possible to reclaim a positive use for the media, or a transparence of repression. The repressive act traverses the same unforeseeable spiral as the terrorist act, no one knows where it will stop, nor all the setbacks and reversals that will ensue. There is no distinction possible between the spectacular and the symbolic, no distinction possible between the crime. 115. And the repression. It is this uncontrollable eruption of reversibility that is the true victory of terrorism. This victory lies not at all in the fact of imposing a negotiation and forcing a government to capitulate. Besides, the objective, most of the time to liberate imprisoned comrades, is typically a zero-sum equation. The stakes are elsewhere. And if power wins out at the level of the objective, it loses at the level of the real stakes. It loses its political definition, and is forced to accept, all the while trying to thwart, this reversibility of all the actors in the same process. Terrorists, killers, hostages, leaders, spectators, public opinion, there is no more innocence in a system which has no meaning. No tragedy either. The force of the terrorists comes to them precisely from the fact that they have no logic. The others do, it is quick, effective, flawless, without scruples, it is why they win. If the terrorists had won, they would not make the errors that they do, but they would no longer be terrorists. To demand that they be at the same time illogical, which gives them their power, and 116. Logical tacticians, which would make them successful, is absurd, again a fantasy of synthesis, and of defense on our part, which allows us to recuperate ourselves in the fury of defeat. Hence the stupidity and the obscenity of all that is reported about the terrorists, everywhere the wish to palm off meaning on them, to exterminate them with meaning, which is more effective than the bullets of specialized commandos. It is still this rage for meaning which makes us, with the best will in the world, treat them like idiots incapable of going all the way and blowing up the airplane and the passengers, which makes us want them not to have won. Not only have they not won, but they have encouraged inordinately the sacred union of all the world forces of repression, they have reinforced the political order, etc. Let's go all the way, they have killed their Stammheim * comrades, since if they had not launched and then botched up this operation, the others would still be living. But all this participates in the same conspiracy of meaning, which amounts to setting an 117. Action in contradiction with itself. Strangulation. 2 Stammheim. The insoluble polemic on the manner in which Bader and his comrades died is itself obscene, and for the same reason, there is an equal obscenity in wanting to forcibly impose meaning on the hijackers' act and in wanting to restore Bader's death to the order of factual reality. Principle of meaning as principle of truth, there you have the real lifeblood of state terrorism. It is to believe that the German government's strategy attains perfection in a single blow. Not only does it link together in an almost improvised manner the bungled taking of hostages with the immediately subsequent liquidation of the prisoners who disturbed it, but does so in such a way that it traps everyone in the hysterical search for truth, which is the best way to abolish the symbolic futility of this death. The hijackers made so many errors at Mogadishu that one can only think that they 118 were done on purpose. They have finally attained their objective obliquely, which was the challenge of their own death, the latter summing up the virtual one of all the hostages, and more radically still, that of the power which kills them. For it absolutely must be repeated that the stakes are not to beat power on its own ground, but to oppose another political order of force. One knows nothing about terrorism if one does not see that it is not a question of real violence, nor of opposing one violence to another, but to oppose to the full violence and to the full order a clearly superior model of extermination and virulence operating through emptiness. The secret is to oppose to the order of the real an absolutely imaginary realm, absolutely ineffectual at the level of reality, but whose implosive energy absorbs everything real and all the violence of real power which founders there. Such a model is no longer of the order of transgression, repression and transgression are of the 119. Old order of the law, that is to say, of the order of a real system in expansion. In such a system, all that comes into contradiction with it, including the violence of its opposite, only makes the expansion accelerate. Here, the virulence comes from the implosion, and the death of the terrorists is of this implosive order, the abolition of value, of meaning, of the real, at a determined point. This point can be infinitesimal, and yet provokes a suction, an absorption, a gigantic convection, as could be seen at Mogadishu. Around this tiny point, the whole system of the real condenses, is tetanized, and launches all its antibodies. It becomes so dense that it goes beyond its own laws of equilibrium and involutes in its own over-effectiveness. At bottom, the profound tactic of simulation is to provoke an excess of reality, and to make the system collapse under an excess of reality. If it is possible then to think that the hijackers have acted purposefully in order to meet their death, this kind of paradoxical death which 120 shines intensely for a moment before falling back into the real, it is possible to think inversely that the German government itself did not commit so many errors in the Bader affair except towards a well-defined end. It was able to stage Bader's death neatly, he did not do it. Far from seeing there a secondary episode, it must be seen as the key to the situation. By sowing this doubt, this deliberate ambiguity concerning the facts, it ensured that the truth about this death, and not the death itself, became fascinating. Everyone exhausted himself in argument and in attempts at clarification, clarifications reinforced by the theatricality of the event which acts as a gigantic dissuasion of the terrorists' execution. Everyone, and above all the revolutionaries who wanted strongly to have it that Bader had been assassinated. They too were vultures of the truth. What's the bloody difference, anyway, suicides or victims of liquidation? The difference, of course, is that if they were liquidated and it can be proven, then the masses, guided by the truth of the facts, would know that the German state is fascist, and would mobilize in order to wreak revenge. What a load of rubbish! A death is romantic or it is not. And 121. In the latter case, there is no need for revenge, it is of the imaginary order. What nonsense to fall back into the reality of a contract of revenge and equivalence. The avengers are worth the moralists, always evaluate the price, and have the just price paid. It matters little that the reality of this death is stolen from you, since it is not of the order of the real, and therein lies its force. You are the one who depreciates it by wanting to institute it as a fact, as capital with the value of death, and to exhaust it in death, whereas this death at full price, not liquidated in the equivalence of meaning and vengeance, opens a cycle of vertigo in which the system itself can only come to be implicated in the end, or brutally, through its own death. Against this vertiginous death the system defends itself by setting in place an inverse cycle, a recycling of the truth against the insoluble cycle of death. Such is the inspired maneuver of the German government, which consists in delivering through its calculated errors an unfinished product, an unrecoverable truth. Thus everyone will exhaust himself finishing the work, and going to the end of the truth. A subtle incitement to self-management. It is content to produce an event in 122. Volving death, others will put the finishing touches on the job. The truth. Even among the very ones who revolt at Bader's death, no one sees through the strap, and all function with the same automatism on the fringe of open complicity which all intelligent power contrives to spread around its decisions. Far from harming him, the flaws of Stammheim stem from a strategy of simulation by the German state which alone would merit analysis and denunciation. A strategy of sacred union, and not at all moral against the terrorist violence, but, much more profoundly, a sacred union in the production of truth, of the facts, of the real. Even if this truth explodes, it will hardly be a scandal. No power will be frightened by it, if necessary, the crew of leaders will be changed. The price of the truth for power is superficial. On the other hand, the benefits of general mobilization, dissuasion, pacification, and mental socialization obtained through this crystallization of the truth are immense. A smart operation, under which Bader's death threatens to be buried definitively. 0. 123.